What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. And in today's video, we have the top 10 essential tips to help prepare you for draft day. As we all know, we are big on strategy on this YouTube channel. So heading into the draft, it should come as no surprise that we want to help you all completely destroy your opponents. So we put together these list of 10 tips and things to remember that you need to know heading into your draft. Keep in mind, these are not in any order. The order of which these are in is not indicative of which is more important. All of these are extremely important, and if you sacrifice in one of these areas in your preparation process, you're definitely going to be selling yourself short. Now, before I jump into these tips, the giveaway is still going on. It's actually ending in 12 days. That's literally less than 2 weeks. So you want to make sure that you're entered to win. We only have about 20-ish people entered. So if you guys want to join, you will have a significant chance to win this signed 8x10 Martavis Bryant photograph. I'll actually give you a chance right now to pause the video, follow both Nick and I on Twitter, and then subscribe to the channel, and that is all you need to do. So here you go, take that chance. So now that you've followed both of us on Twitter, let's jump into the stat of the day. So I do have to let you guys know that yesterday's stat of the day, so which team had 4 running backs that played in over 90 snaps and was pass blocking in over 25% of them? The answer to it was actually Tampa Bay. One person got it, but unfortunately they kind of spammed the teams, so it didn't really count. We're not giving points to anyone, and I apologize. If before this video releases somebody does come in and answers it correctly, we will make sure to get you over the points, but as of today, nobody got it. Please don't spam next time. That's not the way to get the points. One guess is more than enough. Best of luck, and today you have a second chance. So this one should be a little bit easier. Now I do know that you only had between 32 choices in the last one, so I'm going to cut that down to 20. So which top 20 running back in ADP, so drafted as one of the top 20 running backs, had the worst drop rate and the team still intends to pile on more targets and receptions this season? Leave it in the comment section down below and we will let you know in tomorrow's video if you are correct. So without further ado, let's get into the top 10 essential tips to help prepare you for your draft day. So the first thing that we have to talk about is knowing your league settings. And we've had this before. The comment section always gets blown up. Oh, this will never work in my league. Well, yeah, we understand that. Remember, when we make these videos, we don't feel the need to remind you all every time that the advice is tailored primarily to 12-team PPR leagues. 12-team PPR is the most commonly used format in fantasy football, so it makes sense that we create videos based on those settings, but we understand that all you guys across the country, in the world, all have your own separate settings. And while most of you do 12-team PPR, I know that there are a wide variety of settings used. Now, in most cases, you should be able to take our advice and make those minor adjustments based on your scoring format. I personally love 0.5 PPR. I think it's a nice balance between the two. It's actually my preferred format, but that's neither here nor there. The important thing is knowing your league settings heading into the draft. And I know I said this was in no order, but this has to be the most important tip on this list, preparing for your draft. Because if you join a new league and spend all offseason preparing for a 12-team PPR draft, then you show up on draft day and it's a 16-team standard league requiring you to start 2 quarterbacks, do you really think you're going to know what to do? No, you're going to be completely lost. You're going to have almost an impossible time keeping up with the other players in that league that are already used to those settings. So make sure you prepare by asking your league manager to confirm the settings or if there have been any changes. Some things you need to know is the number of teams, the scoring format, the number of players starting at each position, and also any additional point bonuses that are being scored. If you know all of those settings for your league, you're going to be just fine preparing for your draft, but let's dive into why exactly they're important. So the number of teams, that's going to greatly impact your research process because in deeper leagues, you need to have later round targets, not usually broken down because we're talking the 13th round here is already 180 to 200 players off the board already. These are the type of players that aren't even usually broken down by analysts. So if you don't know all these lesser known, lesser factor players in the NFL, you're going to have a hard time with these late round picks. Now in smaller leagues, it's a little bit different. We're talking those 8 to 10 man leagues. In those leagues, you have to start to value the higher producers at each position. Players like Gronk, players like Rodgers, they're going to have much more value in those smaller leagues because each team is essentially stacked. You need to take any advantage you can gain week over week, and those players can provide you that advantage. So knowing how many people are going to be in your league is vitally important when doing your research. Now, as for the number of players that you're going to be starting in your lineups, this is going to play a factor mostly we see in these 2 quarterback leagues. And in those leagues, you basically have to lock up the quarterback position early because the quarterbacks will be going early and they will be going often. If you want to wait until the 5th round before grabbing your first quarterback, you're going to be left with the QB 15, which will be a huge disadvantage heading into the season. Lastly, you need to understand any point bonuses, and this one's also vitally important. Some examples of bonuses are ones like long touchdown bonuses for rushers and receivers, or even quarterbacks that have a passing yardage threshold that they have to accomplish, and they'll get a point bonus like 2 additional points for hitting 300 yards, something along those lines. Now, if you know these types of rules, that's going to help you when targeting certain players. In bonuses for long touchdown leagues, someone like Odell and Tyreek Hill are going to get a significant bump up, while someone like Julio Jones, who only scores about 4 to 6 touchdowns a season, is going to get a bump down. Now, for the other example we provided for the passing yardage, players like Matthew Stafford would see an increased value, while players like Cam Newton, who's more known for his rushing abilities, would see decreased value. So as you can see, understanding these bonuses should definitely alter your rankings, and overall knowing your scoring format and what puts the points on the board is vitally important. Now moving on to the second tip, we have tier-based rankings. We would suggest that you create your own, or if you want to use somebody else's rankings, just make your own adjustments to what they have pre-made. This is going to ensure that you leave the draft feeling good about the players you chose. Now, some analysts' rankings and views may not match up with your own, so if you use their draft rankings only, you may not feel good about the team that you're leaving the draft with. And you notice we said tiers, not just rankings. Everybody brings their rankings to draft day. Now, what's really important is having those tiers. Using rankings is fine, but if you have tiers, you're going to really be setting yourself up for success. Now, regular rankings, while you know who you have ranked ahead of the other player, it still leaves you shooting yourself in the foot when it comes to gaining maximum value on draft day. I'll give you an example, and remember, this is based off current ADP. You have AJ Green, Mike Evans, and Doug Baldwin going back to back to back in the rankings. However, AJ Green and Mike Evans are in the same tier, meaning the difference in production between the two of them is minimal. Whereas we have a tier break after Mike Evans, meaning the difference in expected production between Evans and Baldwin is much greater than that of the difference between AJ Green and Evans. If you went strictly based off the rankings, the expected loss in value by taking Baldwin instead of Evans would hold equal value to the difference between Green and Evans, since technically they're all each ranked one behind the other. In reality though, the difference is much larger than those rankings alone would imply. So that's where the tiers come in. The tiers will show you when there is a gap in expected production. Another thing that they're great with is comparing different positions. It's really difficult to compare a wide receiver to a running back. When you have players tiered out, you can make those decisions a lot easier. So when you're in those situations where you have the choice of a running back or a receiver, but you're unsure which you believe to be more valuable, you can definitely reference your tiers in those situations and go for the guy that you identified as a better producer heading into the draft. So we're talking a lot about rankings. In order to create or adjust your own rankings, you have to have an idea of each player's range of outcomes, and I'm talking every player. So we've talked about this in an earlier video, and you already know the drill. Every player has a floor and every player has a ceiling. They also have an amount of risk that you're going to assume when drafting them. The draft price you pay is factoring in all three of those things: the floor, the ceiling, and the risk. Now, if you really want to start winning your leagues, you have to understand all the factors impacting each player in the draft. I know, most of us have full-time jobs, and it's understandable that this part of the pre-draft research process takes the longest. And believe us, if you do trust certain sources, you can utilize them to basically do the research for you. For example, we do have our own premium rankings. They're broken down into tiers. They have the player breakdowns for every player, the risk ratings with the injury history, and the opportunity shares in their offense. And it also comes with projected target shares for receivers, tight ends, and running backs. So basically a one-stop shop for all your draft needs. So if you are someone like that who doesn't have the time to dig into all the numbers and all the stats each week, then this package is probably for you. But regardless, if you want to win, that is the type of research and work that you need to put in. If you don't have a good understanding of each player's range of outcomes, it's going to be really difficult to predict if the projected upside outweighs the risk based on the draft price. You always want to have the projected upside outweigh the risk, and that is when you truly know that you're getting a good value on a player. If you can find value in multiple stages of the draft, then you're going to be leaving draft day very successfully and very happy. Now keep in mind, no matter how much research you do, the chips do not always fall in your favor. There will be certain rounds where it's your pick and the value just simply isn't presenting itself. In those cases, you do have to make the judgment call on which player you believe to be the best, even if it doesn't feel good. The fact of the matter is, this is going to happen and it's completely normal. Now the next tip for your draft is to prepare for your roster construction. You have to have a good balance of high upside and high floor. You can't have all high upside guys and you can't have all high floor guys. If the risk is relatively low in the player, the chances are the upside's also relatively low. If the risk is relatively high, the upside is usually high. Now, roster construction is good for a few reasons. Now, balancing your roster is important. When it comes to draft picks, if the risk is relatively low on the player, chances are the upside's low as well. If the risk is relatively high, the upside is usually high. The only problem is you cannot have a full team of high upside guys. They normally have that week to week volatility. You also can't draft a team full of safe floor players because then you're going to be lacking the upside that you need to defeat those strong teams in your league. It's all about balance, so you need to have a mix of the high upside players with safe floor players. Not only that, but you have to balance out the amount of players you take at each position in each stage of the draft. Now heading into this season, I like to have more running backs than receivers on my roster, but I'm able to do that in the back half of the draft by avoiding things like taking a quarterback and a tight end as backups. I only have one on the roster. You only have a limited amount of bench spots, so if you are a person who wants to load up RB heavy at the tail end of the draft, you can't do that by sacrificing another position like the receiver position. Having 4 receivers is simply not enough. Balance your team with safe floor guys, throw in that high upside, and make sure you have a safe balance between receiver and running back. The next tip that we have for you guys is to gain an understanding of the average draft position, or ADP. We've spoken a lot about value in this video, and value means absolutely nothing if we don't understand the actual cost of acquisition in the draft. For example, if a car's worth $10,000 and you buy it for $9,000, technically yes, you got a good deal. But if you were able to get that car for $5,000, then clearly you got a better deal. That's the same idea in fantasy football. The goal is to get the best player you can for the least hefty draft price. In other words, get the player as late as you possibly can. Even if you have a player ranked as wide receiver 15 but got him as the 15th wide receiver off the board, technically you would think you got a fair value. But in reality, that's not enough information to know if you stole him at all. If his ADP was wide receiver 21, then you actually got a bad deal because theoretically, you could have possibly grabbed this player much later in the draft than you had to. The fact is, the only way to know what an actual player's value is by understanding the average draft position for each player. Now keep in mind the ADPs will change slightly throughout the offseason, but if you are consistently monitoring the ADP, you can avoid overpaying for players, and come draft day you're going to find some sneaky values and grab these guys for much less than they are worth. So if you're wondering which sites we use to find relatively accurate ADPs at this stage of the offseason, we would recommend using Fantasy Football Calculator or fantasypros.com. As we do get closer to the season, we would recommend that you guys use the live draft results on the platform that you play fantasy football on, but as of today they're probably a little wonky, so I would reference these 2 websites at least for now, then transition over to those as we get closer to the start of the season. So at this point you would have a good understanding of ADP. So what would be next? It would be to identify targets in each stage of the draft. And when we say each stage of the draft, we really mean it. We're talking about 2 to 3 players for each round. By doing this, you will always have a backup plan for when a player you wanted the most gets taken right before your pick, and let's be honest, that happens all of the time. Now we will obviously be doing more videos on early, mid, and late round targets for you guys. These can also be found in our premium package. But you have to get a group of guys at each stage of the draft that you would feel comfortable taking. Now one thing to keep in mind is team pride means absolutely nothing in fantasy. If you're a Raiders fan, you still don't get double points if Amari Cooper scores a touchdown. So there's no need to draft him in the 3rd round when you can get him 2 to 3 rounds later. all the points count the same, so you almost have to forget which jersey these players are wearing. It's nice to be able to root for your favorite team while also stacking up fantasy points, but don't reach a round earlier just to have them on your roster. You have to be drafting unbiased. Now consider it a bonus if you are able to snag a player on your favorite team, but don't go out of your way to land them. Now this same principle goes for players on rival teams. Now I'm an Eagles fan. It has been extremely difficult to draft any Cowboys players, especially considering they play the Eagles twice every year. The worst situation is when you need the fantasy points to win for the week, but you definitely don't want your team to lose. But sometimes we have to put our own feelings aside and get the most amount of points we can for our fantasy team. And if that means drafting Zeke, I'm going to draft Zeke. You have to draft based on value and not based off the jersey. Now the next factor, don't stock up on too many players on the same team. Now let me preface this by saying it's okay to mix and match, just don't go overboard. While this tactic does work in daily fantasy, the reality is rarely does a team perform at a high level week in and week out. By taking too many players on the same team, you're not only limiting your upside, but you're also assuming additional risk and volatility that you could easily avoid. Unless you had the Broncos roster on that record-breaking offensive run, this strategy really doesn't work whatsoever. Don't be drafting Stafford, Tate, Jones, and Riddick all on the same team, then be disappointed when Blunt gets 2 rushing touchdowns and Stafford only throws for 1 touchdown to Kenny Golladay. Those things are bound to happen. However, a receiver and a running back on the same team is actually fine as long as they're in a good offense. A combination like Melvin Gordon, Keenan Allen, Dalvin Cook, Stephon Diggs, those can work because you know that their involvement in the offense and the strength of the team as a whole can produce fantasy points at both positions. Now where you start to assume a little bit more risk is when you start pairing these questionable offenses. Jordan Howard and Allen Robinson, Devontae Freeman, Julio Jones, even AJ Green and Joe Mixon are probably players that you should be avoiding having on the same roster. I know we're making the blanket statement to avoid these scenarios, but if the value is there, you can't avoid it. For instance, if you drafted AJ Green in the 2nd round, and in the 3rd you had a choice between Joe Mixon or Alex Collins, clearly you should take Joe Mixon regardless of being on the same team as AJ Green. You have to stick to your tier-based rankings, and we clearly have Joe Mixon a tier ahead of Alex Collins. When it comes to receivers on the same team though, this is a strict definitely avoid. Demaryius Thomas, Emmanuel Sanders, you don't want them on the same team. Golden Tate, Marvin Jones, we spoke about them earlier, avoid having them on the same team. Even Tyreek Hill and Sammy Watkins. Think about it this way, the likelihood of Demaryius Thomas and Emmanuel Sanders both going over 100 yards and a touchdown in the same week is extremely unlikely. It's possible that it may happen like one time during the season, but in the playoffs you need to have the highest potential upside as possible because you're facing the best teams in a winner go home situation. If you have 2 receivers from 2 different teams, the potential for them to have great weeks is much higher because you're simply getting double the passing attempts. 2 different quarterbacks throwing 2 different balls in 2 separate games, compared to 1 quarterback throwing the same ball to 2 different receivers. You really can't compare the upside of the 2. Now, God forbid you do have 2 wide receivers on the same team and your quarterback goes down with an injury. Now your whole wide receiver core is decimated. You're just assuming too much risk with really no reward. I think it's important that if we're talking about players on the same team, we have to talk about handcuffs. Avoid handcuffs, and this one is simple. By avoid handcuffs, we mean avoid owning 2 backs that are on the same team. We aren't saying to avoid backups, we're just saying avoid having the starter and the backup on the same fantasy roster. Take other players' handcuffs, that way you have the potential of having 2 starters. For example, if you own Kareem Hunt, don't go grab Spencer Ware's insurance. If you own Dalvin Cook, don't go grab Latavius Murray. But if you own Dalvin Cook, having Spencer Ware on your roster could prove very beneficial. You could potentially have 2 starters. By grabbing your own handcuff, you're essentially wasting a bench spot with a player that will be unstartable unless your player gets injured. That's another recipe for limiting your team's upside. Now, the only time we're getting a handcuff for a player on your team is important is when you're heading into the playoffs. Picking one off waivers is definitely an acceptable practice by this stage of the season, simply because your roster is essentially locked in. The trade deadline is completed, and likely if anything were to happen to your starter, there's just not enough time to bounce back with a strong enough team to give you a chance to win. So I hope that explanation makes sense. Draft handcuffs, but not your own. The next important tip is to don't be afraid to reach in the later rounds. There is a stage in the draft where player rankings become very close. The tiers and your tier-based rankings are starting to become much larger, and the difference between player A and player B is extremely negligible. This stage in the draft would be as you approach the double-digit rounds, but this could really start sooner than that if you do have a player that you are truly convinced can outproduce his original draft price. The term for this is called reaching, and it's very important when you are in the draft. It ties in heavily with the identifying targets portion, and it basically means if you have a target that you were sold on, don't wait for them. If you need to get them around early to ensure that they're on your roster, then pull the trigger. If you wait until the actual round that they're being drafted based on their current ADP, there's a strong chance you may not have the option when the turn rolls around to you. And believe us when we say nothing feels worse than losing a player 1 to 2 picks before your pick. As you get later and later into the draft, you can really reach on players all you want. Most of the value's already gone up until that point, and the difference between wide receiver 45 and wide receiver 50 is really non-existent. But don't forget, if you do make a pick in the later rounds, you want a player with a realistic path to being top 20 at the position. Ceiling is everything. Moving on, we have another important tip, and that is be flexible. Don't lock yourself into any one specific strategy. Take the value that falls to you and make a series of good decisions. Don't head into the draft telling yourself you need to grab this many wide receivers by round 5 or that you cannot take a quarterback until round 12. If Cam Newton fell far enough, I'd certainly take him. You just have to be flexible on draft day. Another thing, bye weeks. They're basically completely irrelevant. We wouldn't even suggest you to use them as a tiebreaker. That is what your tier-based rankings are for. If you have 5 players on a week 8 bye, it's really not a big deal. Why? Because you have no idea what your starting lineup is going to look like by week 8. Players bust, you add new ones off the waivers, and trades happen all the time. Your 8th round pick very well could be starting over your 4th round pick by week 3, so losing out on value out of fear of a bye week is one of the quickest ways to lose in the draft. So overall, don't talk yourself out of taking a better player just because of these imaginary rules that you set up in your head. Don't overthink it and let the players fall into your lap. There's only one way to reach that level of comfort on draft day, and that is by doing a serious amount of mock drafts. So the final tip is mock. Do a ton of mock drafts. There is no way to truly be prepared for draft day unless you're doing these mocks. Obviously, nothing is going to compare to the real thing, and live drafts are always significantly harder and more difficult than mocks. But even though they have their fair share of issues, there is still a lot to be gained from them, and they should be worked into your usual draft preparation. And when you're doing these, you have to make sure you're trying each draft position. The draft position significantly impacts the pool of players, especially in the early stages of drafts. And as we all know, most leagues don't release the draft order until right before the draft, so you have to be prepared for every position and every spot. If you do enough of these, by the time draft day finally hits, you should be able to mock draft without even thinking. You should literally be able to have a phone conversation with somebody while mocking, and the person has no idea that you're even slightly distracted. And if you are able to reach this level of comfort, just make sure that at this point you don't stop mocking altogether. ADPs change, and that could change your process in these drafts. Basically, you want to be able to get to a point where you understand all the trends, knowing instantly if players are either a steal or if they're overpriced. And then be confident with your next move after a target of yours gets taken right before your pick, because we know these things are just going to happen. So that's the list, guys. I do have a couple final thoughts. So first things first, try to see things from a different perspective. Don't be locked into your views on certain players all offseason. If you like a player early in the offseason, or you don't like a player early in the offseason, make sure that you still have an open mind for the next couple of months. Things change, situations change, injuries happen. You can't oust a player because you simply don't like them. You have to take in all of the facts and make that decision unbiased. Another thing, there's no need to commit to any one given draft day strategy. Any strategy you have heading into the draft can quickly be your downfall if you ignore opportunity and value. And also, just know, you don't win the league in the draft. You don't win it, but you can certainly lose it. If you have a bad draft, you're going to have a tough season. But if you have a good draft, you still have a lot of work to do working the waivers and making your start and sit decisions. But either way, have fun. This is the time we've all been waiting for. Why not suggest a live draft instead of an online draft? Make it a party. And even if you do an online draft, try to make it a good night. Order some pizza, buy some beer. This is what we've been waiting for all off season. But there you have it, guys. The top 10 essential draft day tips. Now, if you guys have some draft day tips that I did not list in here, feel free to leave them in the comment section down below. We're interested to see what kind of things you guys come up with. But if you did enjoy this video, hit that thumbs up button. We thank you all for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.